They asked him who I was, and my husband looked right at me and said, "Just my wife. She doesn't really do anything." 40 people in that room. Half of them investors holding pens over term sheets worth $11 million. And he said it with a small laugh, like it was a joke we shared, like I would laugh too. I didn't laugh. I picked up my glass of water and I let the silence sit there for exactly 4 seconds before I set it back down. Nobody in that room knew that 4 seconds was the last polite thing I would ever do for Marcus Doyle. My name is Renata Voss. I kept my maiden name when we married, which Marcus always said was a phase I'd grow out of. 8 years later, I still hadn't grown out of it. And neither had the 49% ownership stake sitting quietly in a holding company under that same name, tucked inside the very business. He was pitching to a room full of strangers as entirely his own. Here's what this story is not. It is not a story about a woman who got lucky and married rich. It is not a story about revenge dressed up as justice. It is the story of what a man shows you when he believes the only person watching is someone who doesn't count. And it's the story of what happens when that person turns out to be the one holding the paperwork. 9 years ago, before Marcus and I were married, before Doyle Structural Group existed as anything more than a name on a business card, I was the one with the engineering degree, structural analysis, materials science, 5 years at a firm downtown reviewing load calculations on high-rises before I ever met him. Marcus was a project manager at the same firm, charming in the specific way that makes people forget to check his work. He had the vision. I had the license. That distinction matters more than people think in construction, because visions don't get buildings permitted. Stamped calculations do, and only a licensed structural engineer can put that stamp down. When Marcus decided to start his own firm, he needed 2 things he didn't have: capital and a stamp. I had both. My grandmother had left me a modest inheritance 3 years earlier, sitting mostly untouched in a conservative fund, and I had spent 5 years building the kind of professional reputation that makes lenders comfortable. So when Marcus came to me with a business plan sketched on the back of a takeout menu, I didn't just believe in him. I funded him. $210,000 of my inheritance went into Doyle Structural Group's first year of operating costs, and because I wasn't willing to hand over that kind of money without protection, I insisted on paperwork. Real paperwork. A holding company, Renfield Holdings, named as a nod to nothing in particular, except that it sounded forgettable. And forgettable was exactly what I wanted it to be. Renfield held 49% of Doyle Structural Group. Marcus held 51%. He signed it without much of a fight because at the time, 51% of nothing still felt like nothing. And he needed the money more than he needed the ego. For the first 3 years, that ownership structure didn't matter to anyone but our accountant, because the company barely survived. I kept my job at the downtown firm and worked nights reviewing Marcus's early projects, catching mistakes that would have gotten the company sued into the ground. He never asked me to stop working. He needed the second income and he needed the free labor, though he never called it that. The turn happened in year 4, when Doyle Structural Group landed the contract for the Ash Grove Commercial Tower, a 14-story mixed-use building that put the company on the map in a way nothing had before. Marcus became, almost overnight, the guy people wanted at their dinner parties. Local business press ran a piece on him, with a headline calling him a self-made force in commercial development. Self-made. I read that word so many times it stopped looking like a real word to me. I want to be honest about something. I didn't mind at first that the credit skewed toward him. He was the face of the company, the one in client meetings, the one whose name was easier to put on a magazine spread than mine, quietly filed away as a silent partner. I told myself the money and the structure mattered more than the recognition. I told myself that for 4 more years. The shift in how he spoke about me started small, the way most erosion does. He introduced me at industry events as his wife. Full stop, no mention of a career, no mention of ownership. When people asked what I did, he'd answer for me before I could. She used to do some engineering work, back before the kids. We don't have kids. I noticed him saying it anyway, like it explained something, like it excused something. At home, the language shifted too. He started calling my old firm my little office job, even though I hadn't worked there in 3 years by that point, because Doyle Structural Group had grown enough that he'd asked me to come on formally as Director of Structural Compliance, a title that came with real responsibilities and, conveniently, no public mention in any press material. Then came Priya Anand. Priya joined as Head of Business Development, 18 months before the night that changed everything. She was 34. sharp in the way that made rooms go quiet when she started talking, and completely unafraid of Marcus. In a way, most of his employees weren't. I liked her initially. She seemed like exactly the kind of hire that pushes a company forward. It took me nearly a year to understand that what she was pushing forward was not the company's growth. It was her own position inside it, specifically the position directly beside Marcus. I noticed the late meetings first, then the trips that didn't quite match the client rosters when I cross-referenced them against project files I still had access to as Director of Compliance. Then, 6 months before the Investor Gala, I noticed something more specific and more damaging than an affair. Priya had drafted a restructuring proposal, quietly circulated to 2 members of our 5-person advisory board, that recommended consolidating equity control under Marcus alone ahead of the Series A raise we were preparing, citing what the document called simplified governance for investor confidence. Simplified governance was a polite phrase for erasing my 49% from every conversation the company was about to have with outside money. I didn't confront Marcus about the proposal right away. I did what I do best. I read everything twice, and I waited. What I found, reading it a third time, was worse than a suggestion. It was a plan already in motion. The proposal referenced a shareholder buyout clause, one that technically existed in our original operating agreement, allowing majority ownership to force a valuation-based buyout of minority shares under specific conditions, including what the clause called strategic misalignment with company direction. Marcus was 51%. I was 49%. On paper, if he could get 2 advisory board members to formally document strategic misalignment, he could begin proceedings to force me out of my own company, using my own money, at a valuation his own newly hired head of business development would help set. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not an argument, not a divorce filing, a structured, board-documented mechanism to remove me from a business I had personally financed into existence, using a clause I had insisted on including specifically to protect myself from being pushed out by an investor. I had built a lock he was learning to pick it. I contacted our company's outside counsel, a woman named Denise Okafor, who had drafted our original operating agreement and had no personal loyalty to Marcus beyond billable hours. I asked her, hypothetically, whether the strategic misalignment clause could actually be triggered against a shareholder, with no documented performance issues, solely on a board recommendation. She was quiet for a moment, then told me the clause required a supermajority board vote, 4 of 5 members, not 2, and that any attempt to trigger it without proper documentation of actual misalignment, not manufactured misalignment, would constitute a breach that I could challenge and very likely win, with damages. She asked me why I was asking. I told her I wanted to understand my own protections better. She didn't push further, but I could hear in her voice that she suspected exactly what was happening, because she had seen this particular kind of quiet erosion before, in other marriages, other companies. I spent the following weeks doing something Marcus never once suspected I was capable of, because he had spent years describing me to other people as someone who didn't really do anything. I built a case, every email between Priya and the 2 sympathetic board members, forwarded through a compliance monitoring system. I had legitimate access to his director of structural compliance, since company governance documents fell under that oversight. Every meeting where Marcus discussed the raise without including me, despite my equity stake requiring disclosure under our own operating agreement. Every instance where investor materials described sole founder, Marcus Doyle, without any mention of Renfield Holdings, materials that, if presented to investors as accurate ownership representation, constituted securities misrepresentation, serious enough to collapse the entire funding round if the Series A investors ever found out before signing. That last part mattered more than anything else I found. Marcus wasn't just trying to push me out quietly. He was actively misrepresenting company ownership to sophisticated investors, conducting real due diligence, the kind of due diligence that eventually, inevitably, finds a holding company with 49% of the equity that nobody mentioned in the data room. I could have stopped it there, privately, with a phone call to Denise and a strongly worded letter. Marcus would have backed down. He always did, quietly, when confronted directly, because confrontation without an audience was the one thing he'd never learned to perform his way through. But I thought about 8 years. I thought about my grandmother's inheritance sitting in a company built on my stamp and my money and my nights spent finding his mistakes. So his buildings didn't fall down. I thought about the word housewife, which I knew somewhere in the back of my mind He was rehearsing for a room I hadn't been invited into yet. The Investor Gala was scheduled for a Thursday evening at a downtown hotel ballroom. The formal close of an $11 million Series A round Marcus had spent a year chasing. I was invited technically as his wife, seated at a table near the back, rather than among the executive team, which told me everything about how he'd decided to stage the evening before it even began. I arrived in a plain navy dress, deliberately unremarkable, the kind of thing that disappears in a room full of tailored suits and confident posture. I wanted to disappear that night. I wanted him comfortable enough to say exactly what he actually believed, out loud, in front of the people whose money depended on the truth. He didn't disappoint me. An investor named Harold Chen, sharp, older, the kind of man who'd funded and lost money on enough companies to ask the questions everyone else was too polite to ask, turned to me mid-conversation and asked what I did. Not unkindly, genuinely curious, the way people are when they notice someone at the edge of a room saying nothing. Marcus answered before I could open my mouth. "Oh, that's just my wife," he said, with the small laugh I mentioned before, the one designed to make the room laugh with him. "She doesn't really do anything. Keeps the home running, you know how it is." Harold Chen looked at me for a moment longer than the joke deserved. I think he sensed, the way sharp people sometimes do, that something in the room had just shifted, even if he couldn't name what. I set my water glass down. I smiled, the kind of smile that costs nothing and reveals nothing, and I said, quite simply, "That's an interesting way to describe your co-founder." The room didn't go silent immediately. It took a second for the sentence to land, the way a stone takes a second to actually hit water after you've thrown it. Marcus laughed again, but thinner this time, and said something about how I liked my little jokes. I didn't laugh with him. I asked Harold if he'd received the full data room package, the one with the capitalization table. He said he had, and that he'd actually had a question about an entity called Renfield Holdings listed at 49%, which his team hadn't been able to get a clear answer on from Marcus's office. I told him Renfield Holdings was my holding company, that I had personally funded Doyle Structural Group's first year of operations, that I was, and had been for 8 years, the company's licensed structural engineer of record, the person whose stamp was legally required on every calculation the company had ever submitted for permit, and that I was, by any accurate reading of the operating agreement everyone in that room was about to sign alongside a term sheet, the company's co-founder and 49% owner. Marcus's face did something I had never seen it do before. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to a man recalculating, very quickly how much damage was already done and whether there was still a version of the evening he could salvage. He tried. I'll give him that. He stepped in smoothly. Told Harold that I was being modest, that of course my contribution was significant, that we'd clarify the details after the event. He put his hand on my back, guiding me gently away from the conversation, and murmured something about not embarrassing him in front of investors. I didn't move, I said, loudly enough for the cluster of people near us to hear clearly, that I wasn't the one who'd told a room full of investors that a licensed structural engineer with 49% equity doesn't really do anything. I said that if anyone in the room wanted an accurate accounting of the company's ownership before they signed anything, I'd be glad to walk them through the actual data room myself, since I was the one who had, ironically, compiled half of it. Harold Chen set down his drink. He asked quite plainly whether the term sheet on the table that evening had been drafted with accurate representation of company ownership, because his fund had a policy about proceeding with any round where founder representations turned out to be materially incomplete. Marcus tried to laugh it off one more time. Nobody laughed with him. I want to pause here and tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something quieter and colder, the particular clarity that comes when a suspicion you've been carrying for months finally gets confirmed by the person's own face in real time, in front of witnesses. I watched Marcus understand, all at once, that the woman he'd spent 2 years describing as someone who didn't really do anything had just calmly, without raising her voice, made it impossible for his funding round to close that night. Priya appeared at his side within the minute, the way people do when they've been listening, from a few feet away and sense their own positions starting to wobble. She said something about how this was clearly a personal matter that didn't need to play out in front of investors. I looked at her and said that a restructuring proposal recommending my removal from a company I financed drafted by her and circulated to 2 board members without my knowledge. It was also a personal matter, and yet here we all were. That landed harder than anything I'd said to Marcus directly. Harold Chen turned to his associate and said, quietly but not quietly enough, that they should probably step outside for a few minutes. The evening didn't end in a dramatic collapse right there in the ballroom. It ended the way these things actually end in real life. Slower and more procedural than fiction usually allows, but no less final. 2 of the 4 investor groups in the room formally paused their participation in the round that same week, citing unresolved governance and disclosure concerns. Denise Okafor, our outside counsel, was formally engaged the following Monday, not by Marcus, but by me, in my capacity as a 49% shareholder, requesting a full audit of recent board communications, including the restructuring proposal, including every email Priya had sent to the 2 sympathetic board members. What that audit found was worse for Marcus than even I had expected. Priya hadn't just drafted a proposal to consolidate equity. She had, in preparation for the round, quietly negotiated a side agreement with one of the 2 board members, promising him an advisory seat with equity compensation in exchange for supporting the restructuring vote, an arrangement that had never been disclosed to the rest of the board, and that constituted, according to Denise, a clear breach of fiduciary duty on the part of both Priya and the board member involved. The board member resigned within the week, rather than face a formal governance review. Priya was terminated for cause, which under her employment agreement meant forfeiting a stock option package she had been counting on as the real prize behind her 2 years of quiet maneuvering. She left without severance, and I later heard, without the glowing reference she'd expected to carry into her next role. Marcus and I didn't divorce immediately. I want to be honest about that too, because these stories often skip the parts that don't resolve as cleanly as a courtroom scene. We spent 3 more months in a strange, formal coexistence, living in the same house, running the same company, speaking to each other mostly through Denise's office. He apologized more than once, in the specific tone of a man who is sorry about consequences, rather than about the thing that caused them. He asked what it would take to fix things, both the marriage and the company's now damaged fundraising position. I told him the company could be fixed. Denise and I restructured the operating agreement so that any future equity or governance changes required unanimous shareholder approval, not a board workaround. We brought in a new head of business development, someone with no interest in consolidating anyone's power but the company's. Within 4 months, we closed a smaller but cleaner series, a round with 2 of the original investor groups, including Harold Chen's fund, who told me directly that he'd come back, specifically because he trusted the diligence of a shareholder who read her own data room before anyone else did. The marriage was a different repair, and eventually I decided it wasn't one worth making. Not because of the affair alone, though that was its own quiet ending. It was because I understood, finally and completely, that the word housewife hadn't been a slip of the tongue in front of investors. It had been the truth of how he saw me, worn down to its plainest form in a moment he thought had no consequences. 8 years of stamped calculations, of financed dreams, of nights spent finding his mistakes before they became someone else's tragedy. Reduced to a laugh line for a room full of strangers. We divorced quietly, the following spring, under the terms Denise had built years earlier at my insistence. My 49% was untouched by the proceedings, protected exactly the way I'd designed it to be back when protecting myself still felt like an unnecessary precaution, rather than a foregone conclusion. Marcus kept his 51% and, eventually, his title as founder and CEO, a title I no longer had any interest in contesting, because by then I understood that titles had never been the thing I actually needed. I still hold my stake in the company today. I still review the structural calculations that go out under our stamp, because some habits are simply who you are and not who you're married to. I don't attend the Investor Galas anymore. I don't need to. My name is on the paperwork that makes the whole building possible, in every sense of that word, and I've learned that the people who matter always find their way to reading the actual documents eventually. Here is what I want to leave you with. A man will tell you exactly what he believes you're worth the moment he thinks. There's nothing at stake in saying it out loud. Marcus didn't think there was anything at stake in that ballroom. He thought I was decoration at a table near the back, a wife whose only function that evening was to nod politely while he explained his own success to people who'd funded half of it without knowing her name. He was wrong about what was at stake. He was wrong about what I'd built. And he was wrong about what I'd protected. Quietly, for 8 years. precisely because I understood long before he did exactly how little my contribution meant to him unless I made it impossible to ignore. The measure of a person isn't what they call you when they think you're listening. It's what they call you when they think it doesn't matter whether you hear it at all. If this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. Subscribe and share it with someone who's been quietly holding more of the weight than anyone around them realizes. Every week I bring you stories about the people who were underestimated, right up until the moment it cost someone everything.